Our culture is making us sick. Dr. Gabor Maté on toxic society. There's a question I've been asking for decades that most of medicine refuses to ask. Not, what is wrong with this person? That's the question medicine is built around. The diagnosis, the disease category, the symptom cluster. What is broken and how do we fix it? My question is different. What happened to this person? Those two questions sound similar. They're not. They lead to completely different places, different understandings of illness, different approaches to treatment, different conclusions about what health even means. And the reason medicine avoids my question isn't because it's the wrong question. It's because the honest answer implicates something much larger than any individual patient. When one person gets sick, you look for what's wrong with them. When everyone gets sick in the same ways, when addiction, depression, anxiety, autoimmune disease, and chronic pain are running through an entire society at epidemic rates, you have to start asking what's wrong with the conditions people are living in. That's the question this video is about. Let's start with stress, because the word has been so overused that most people have lost track of what it actually means physiologically. Stress isn't feeling overwhelmed. It isn't having a bad week. Stress is a specific cascade of physiological responses, hormones flooding your system, immune function suppressed, inflammation triggered, your entire biology reorganized around immediate survival. The stress response evolved to handle acute threats, a predator, a physical confrontation, a sudden emergency. In those situations, the stress response is brilliantly designed. It mobilizes energy, sharpens focus, suppresses functions that aren't immediately necessary for survival. And when the threat passes, the system is supposed to return to baseline. Here's the problem. The body doesn't distinguish between a lion chasing you and a performance review, between physical danger and financial insecurity, between a threat to your life and a threat to your social status. The same hormonal cascade, cortisol, adrenaline, the whole sequence, floods your system in response to all of these. And modern life is full of threats that never resolve. The financial insecurity that doesn't go away after the month ends. The job that requires constant performance under surveillance. The social comparison that social media makes continuous and inescapable. The isolation that persists through crowded rooms. These aren't acute stressors that pass. They're chronic, low-grade, unrelenting. And chronic stress is more damaging than acute stress precisely because it never gives the system a chance to return to baseline. The body keeps the score. That phrase from Bessel van der Kolk's important work captures something real. The stress doesn't disappear when you stop thinking about it. It lives in the body, in disrupted cortisol rhythms, in dysregulated immune function, in the elevated inflammation that's now understood to underlie depression, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and a long list of the conditions most characteristic of modern life. The diseases of our time are not primarily genetic bad luck. They are, in large part, the biological cost of the way we're living. Now let me tell you something about childhood that medicine has known for decades and somehow still hasn't made central to how we think about health. Early experiences don't just shape who you become, they shape your biology. The first years of life are when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response system is being calibrated, when the immune system is learning how reactive to be, and the primary input to all of these systems is the relational environment, specifically whether the child experiences consistent, warm, attuned connection with caregivers. A child raised in an environment of reliable emotional availability develops a nervous system calibrated for safety. The stress response learns that threats are temporary, that help is available, that the world is basically navigable. A child raised in an environment of chronic stress, neglect, emotional unavailability, or trauma develops a nervous system calibrated for threat. The stress response learns to stay on, to treat uncertainty as danger, to assume the worst. I want to be clear. These are not metaphors. They are measurable biological differences, differences in cortisol levels, in vagal tone, the measure of the nervous system's capacity to self-regulate, in inflammatory markers, in the very structure of regions of the brain involved in emotion and stress response. In the 1990s, researchers at Kaiser Permanente conducted what became known as the ACE studies, Adverse Childhood Experiences. They asked a large sample of adults, mostly middle class, employed, insured, about their childhood histories. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, loss. And then they looked at health outcomes. The results were striking enough that the researchers initially questioned them. More adverse childhood experiences predicted dramatically higher rates of heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, liver disease, depression, and early death. The relationship was dose-dependent. The more adverse experiences, the worse the outcomes. Childhood trauma turned out to be among the strongest predictors of adult chronic illness, stronger than many of the risk factors medicine spends enormous resources trying to address. The body learns something in childhood about what the world is like, and it spent the next decades responding accordingly. I've spent much of my career working with people who are addicted to heroin, to alcohol, to cocaine, to gambling, to work, to sex, to screens, and in all that time across thousands of patients, I have never met an addict whose addiction didn't make sense once I understood their history. That's the argument I want to make carefully, because it's often misunderstood. I'm not saying addiction is a choice. I'm not romanticizing it or excusing the harm it causes. I'm saying that every addiction I have ever encountered was serving a function, managing pain, creating relief, providing a sense of control or connection or escape that the person couldn't find another way to access. The heroin addict who tells me the drug is the only time they feel okay. The alcoholic whose drinking is the only way they've found to quiet the voice in their head that says they're worthless. The workaholic, and I include myself here, who can only feel okay when producing because stillness brings up feelings that seem unbearable. Addiction isn't a moral failing. It isn't primarily a brain disease, though the brain changes in addiction are real. It's an adaptation to pain, a solution, a costly, destructive, ultimately self-defeating solution to a problem that was real. When we ask, why the addiction, we're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why the pain? And the answer to that question almost always leads back to adverse experiences in childhood, in development, in the relational environment that shaped the person's sense of self and their nervous system's capacity to regulate. This is why treatment that addresses only the addiction, without addressing what the addiction was managing, has such poor outcomes. You remove the solution without addressing the problem, and the problem finds another solution, or the person returns to the one that worked before. Now I want to talk about what our culture specifically does to children, not as a critique of individual parents. Most parents are doing their best under real constraints, as an analysis of the environment we've built and what it costs developmentally. Economic pressure on parents means less time and less emotional presence. This isn't a parenting failure, it's a structural one. When both parents are working multiple jobs or grinding through 60-hour weeks to maintain a middle-class life, or managing the chronic stress of financial precarity, the emotional attunement that children need gets crowded out, not because the parents don't care, because the system doesn't accommodate caring. Competitive achievement culture has extended downward into childhood in ways that would have been unrecognizable 2 generations ago. Children are being prepared for competitive college admissions from primary school. Their worth, and their sense of their own worth, gets attached to performance, achievement, rankings, scores. The child who internalizes this message learns something dangerous, that love and acceptance are conditional, that who they are isn't enough, only what they produce matters. This produces anxiety, it produces perfectionism, it produces a fragile sense of self that depends permanently on external validation. Because the internal sense of being okay, which should be established in early childhood, was never built on solid ground. Screen-based childhoods are replacing the unstructured play and peer interaction through which children have always developed emotional regulation, social cognition, and the capacity for genuine connection. I want to be careful here. The problem isn't technology itself. The problem is what gets displaced. Children need boredom. They need conflict with peers that isn't mediated by adults. They need to navigate the physical world with their bodies. They need the slow, unoptimized, gloriously inefficient experience of just being children. And then there's the medicalization. Children are increasingly diagnosed and medicated for behaviors, inattention, hyperactivity, defiance, emotional dysregulation, that are often completely understandable responses to the environments they're in. A child who can't sit still in an overstimulating classroom, who can't focus because they're anxious, who acts out because they're overwhelmed. That child is responding reasonably to an unreasonable situation. Medicating the response without examining the situation is the individual diagnostic model at its most reductive. I want to say something about loneliness that goes beyond the statistics, though the statistics are alarming. Loneliness isn't the absence of people. You can be deeply lonely in a crowded room, in a marriage, in a family, at a party surrounded by people who know your name. Loneliness is the absence of genuine connection, of being truly known, truly seen, truly accepted for what you actually are rather than what you perform. This distinction matters because modern life is very good at producing the appearance of connection while systematically undermining its substance. Social media gives you followers, likes, an audience, the metrics of connection without its content. Work relationships are professional, bounded, conditional, instrumental. Even friendships often operate at the level of what's presentable rather than what's real. The body doesn't care about the appearance of connection. It cares about the substance. And loneliness, genuine loneliness, activates the same neural pain pathways as physical injury. This isn't metaphor. This is neuroscience. Social disconnection is processed by the brain as a survival threat, because in evolutionary terms, it was. The isolated human was the vulnerable human. The rejected human was the dying human. We've built a society extraordinarily efficient at producing isolated individuals. And then we're puzzled by the epidemic of chronic pain, depression, addiction, and illness that follows. The medical system doesn't exist outside the culture. It reflects it. A healthcare system built around efficiency, throughput, and productivity treats patients the way the economy treats everyone, as units to be processed. The 15-minute appointment isn't a failure of individual doctors. It's the logical output of a system that has decided structurally that the time it takes to ask what happened to someone isn't billable. Pharmaceutical solutions are structurally preferred over social ones for reasons that have nothing to do with efficacy. A medication can be patented. A pill can be prescribed in 3 minutes. The social conditions that produce the illness, the isolation, the trauma, the inequality, the economic precarity, cannot be packaged or sold, so they remain outside the frame of medical intervention. I've watched doctors, brilliant, compassionate people, systematically burned out by a system that asks them to process patients at a rate incompatible with actual healing. The rates of depression, addiction, and suicide among physicians are extraordinary. The healers are being made sick by the system of healing. That tells you something about the system. Here's a finding from public health research that I think deserves much more attention than it gets. More unequal societies have worse health outcomes, not just for the poor, across the income distribution. Countries and regions with greater income inequality show higher rates of chronic illness, mental health problems, addiction, and early death at every economic level compared to more equal societies. The mechanism isn't just poverty, it's status anxiety, the chronic stress of living in a society organized around competition for scarce position. In a highly unequal society, everyone is subject to this stress. The middle-class person anxious about falling is experiencing a real threat. The upper middle-class person anxious about their children's position is experiencing a real threat. The constant comparison, the performance of success, the fear of losing ground, these are chronic stressors that activate the same physiological pathways as any other threat. And inequality corrodes the social fabric that buffers against stress. Trust, community, the sense that others are on your side. These are genuine protective factors for health, and highly unequal societies consistently show lower levels of all of them. The competition for status makes everyone a potential rival. The fragmentation of community leaves everyone more exposed. A society organized around competition produces a population in a state of chronic threat activation, and a population in a state of chronic threat activation gets sick, predictably, measurably, across conditions and demographics. I want to tell you about a pattern I call the good boy, or the good girl, because I see it everywhere, and I lived it myself. Many of the most high-functioning, outwardly successful people I know achieved their success through a specific kind of disconnection. They learned early in life that love and acceptance were conditional on performance, on emotional management, on not being too much or too needy or too difficult. They learned to read environments and give people what those environments required. They became very, very good at meeting external expectations. What they lost in the process was access to their own inner experience, their own needs, their own authentic emotional reality, because those things were liabilities in the environment they were navigating. This disconnection is adaptive in childhood. It's how you survive an environment that doesn't have room for who you actually are. In adulthood, it produces people who are competent, driven, often brilliant, and profoundly alienated from themselves, who don't know what they want because they've spent their lives figuring out what others want from them, who achieve and find that achievement brings no lasting satisfaction because the self that was supposed to be satisfied got left behind somewhere. I'm not describing other people here, I'm describing myself. My own diagnosis of ADHD in my 60s, when it finally had a name, my history of compulsive behavior, my workaholism, my difficulty with emotional presence despite decades of work as a physician and therapist. All of it makes complete sense when I look at my own history, honestly. The story I tell about my patients is my story too. That's not incidental. It's the point. What would a genuinely healthy culture look like? Not a perfect one, not utopia, just a culture that took seriously what the science of human development has been clearly showing for decades and made decisions accordingly. It would treat the quality of early childhood development as a primary social and economic priority, not an afterthought, not a women's issue, not a private family matter. A society that understood what the ACE studies showed would invest in the conditions of early childhood with the same urgency it invests in defense or infrastructure. Because the cost of not doing so, in healthcare spending, in criminal justice, in lost human potential, in the downstream social dysfunction of adults who were harmed as children, vastly exceeds the cost of prevention. It would organize work around human needs rather than organizing humans around work's needs. This sounds radical. It isn't. It's just taking seriously the evidence about what humans need to function well: connection, autonomy, adequate rest, time with their children, and building economic structures that don't systematically prevent people from having those things. It would recognize that pharmaceutical solutions to social problems are not solutions, that medicating the symptoms of an ill society without addressing the society is not medicine. It's the management of a population, and it would ask consistently at every level, not what is wrong with this person, but what happened to this person. And then one step further, what are the conditions that keep producing this suffering, and take the answer seriously enough to do something about it. That's not a utopian vision. It's just honesty about what the science says, applied to the decisions we make as a society. We've been avoiding that honesty for a long time. The cost of avoiding it keeps going up.